of the French Revolution through the radical phase up to Napoleon. And at the end of the last video, I was talking about Napoleon's political reforms. And the short version of that is he did a lot of things that made a lot of people happy. But at the same time, he crowned himself as an emperor in France. Now let's see how he was able to do that militarily. Obviously, his rise through the ranks was through the military. I briefly brushed by this last time, but what happens militarily in France with the beginning of Austria and Prussia declaring war after the French revolutionaries take Louis XVI's head off um, is coalition after coalition attacks France. Those coalitions largely consist of the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, and the British, to be sort of your big four, with others joining. And Napoleon, who started, was sort of a child of the revolution, if you will, um, rises through the ranks of the military, starting with his success in Toulon in France, defeating the British, and continuing with his great success in Italy, where he was wildly popular, and when he sort of realized that he wanted to be a ruler. Um, what happens with Napoleon is up to 1804, which is sort of where we were talking about last class with some of his reforms, or last video with some of his reforms. Um, is that in 1805, militarily, he makes his first mistake. So after the coronation in 1804 and the Napoleonic Code in 1804, in 1805, he makes his first military mistake by trying to invade Britain. We've seen Hitler failed to do this as well. Napoleon loses at the Battle of Trafalgar. And so this changes his scope for this war. So he decides maybe he can't take Britain with a naval invasion, but what he can do is he can cut them off economically. And so he starts up what's called the continental system, which I'll explain, on my next slide here in a second, is he tries to choke them out economically by not letting anyone in Europe, including everyone in this red line, trade with Britain. And because of that, he hopes to then, make them weaker that way and then maybe be able to defeat them militarily. In the process, coalition after coalition, as you see in these next few notes, uh, come together and try to defeat France, and they never do. Remember, France is the most populated and economically, strongest country when all of this, French Revolution begins. So it has the population. It raises a huge army with these quote unquote citizen soldiers and mass conscription, and they're successful. And Napoleon's obviously a leader of this very successful army. And as you see in the slide, he defeats Russia, he defeats Austria multiple times, and is just struggling with Britain. So his answer to that is the continental system, which is, in this red line sort of says, this is all of the French countries that they've defeated and or have entered a treaty with that agree not to engage with trade with Britain. And Russia breaks that. And Napoleon's big mistake is he tries to punish Russia for breaking the continental system, which you see again over here. And when he does, he brings 600,000, upwards of 600,000 troops into Russia to defeat Moscow. He does, but in the process, he loses his entire fighting force that he returns with something like 20,000. So though he wins in Moscow with the scorched earth policy of the Russians, which is, burning and destroying everything that the French need to live off the land, and with the very, very, very cold winter that Napoleon runs into on his walk back from Moscow to Paris, he loses everything. And precisely because of this, the same enemies that have been fighting France throughout, Russia, Britain, Prussia, Sweden, Austria, they come together, and knowing that Napoleon is weak, they attack Paris and defeat France. So this is the first time France has fallen. It takes 6 coalitions of enemies to finally get France. That pushes Napoleon into exile. But Napoleon, not one to give up that easily, returns from exile for 100 days, gathers up an army to go back after this coalition that defeated him, but loses again in modern-day Belgium at Waterloo in 1815. And after his 100 days back in power, he gets exiled again, this time a lot longer, a lot further away, never to be seen again in France. He dies in isolation on the island of St. Helena. And in that process, the coalition that takes France reinstates the same House of Bourbon, Louis XVIII. However, under a constitutional monarchy, including the rule of law that Napoleon put together, the Napoleonic Code. So Louis XVI was guillotined. His son died in prison during the Revolution, and then Louis XVIII ends up rising to power in France. Then what has to happen is all of the territory that France gained, which was some here in what's now Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, some here, Italy area, has to then be divvied back up. And this is what happens at the Congress of Vienna, which you see met for 10 months to figure out what to do. And they established some new countries, including putting the German Confederation together, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Poland, and Warsaw. The interesting note on this is this: that what happens here is, despite all of the French Revolution and the push towards democracy and republic, what happens in the Congress of Vienna is they restore monarchies. So all of the push by the French to free the slaves and abolish feudalism and all the stuff that they're doing as an invading army as conquerors gets replaced when kings get put back in power at the Congress of Vienna after all these French Revolutionary Wars. So because of that, the French Revolution ends up ends in a very strange place where, in some ways, there's no more king, like they chop the king's head off, but they end up with Napoleon, and then they end up back with Louis XVIII. So we still end up with the same ruling family that we had at the beginning. The same way that there's, the French revolutionaries wanted to get rid of the Catholic Church, but then Napoleon recognizes the Catholic Church, including so much so that he has the Pope come to his coronation. And at the same time, there's freedom of religion and there's a constitution, so it's a constitutional monarchy. And then this gets to the point I was just making, which is, equality and liberty become highly valued. And it's something that France is exporting in its battles with the other countries with Europe. And in France itself, and part of this, their conquest brings a mass political consciousness to the people. Remember way back to the first video when I was talking about the third estate. The people, the broad sense of the people of France are now very political. And this has moved across Europe. At the same time, Europe ends up with a lot of monarchs, thanks in part to the Congress of Vienna. So while there's revolution and equality and liberty and all that stuff is now at the forefront of politics in Europe, we still are in a position with a lot of monarchies. So we end up in this strange the French Revolution ends with a lot of the stuff in place. A lot of great changes, but at the same time it looks very similar in a lot of the same ways in terms of the powers that be and the political structure. So in a lot of ways, there's still a long way for the French to go to get democracy in the democratic republic they're looking for. It's only a matter of time until 1830 when they have another revolution, and then there's another monarch, and then that person gets kicked out, and it gets dicey for quite some time. So that's the PowerPoint and the summary of the French Revolution as quickly as I can do it. Obviously, you'll be required to analyze, the end result of the French Revolution on your test, so I don't want to give away too much. But I hope this helps you guys summarize a lot of the material that was covered in class. I will see you guys Wednesday for your test.